It is the first time Mondale has testified on Capitol Hill since leaving office 8 years ago. He recalled the rigors of his own presidential campaign in 1984, the almost endless coast-to-coast plane rides, punctuated by quick stops somewhere in between.
There's something profoundly beyond human scale involved in the present anarchy.
And Mondale recounted the condition of the Democratic candidates earlier this year.
Poor creatures came to Minnesota to debate, and they were all zonked. They didn't have eyes, they had crosses in there.
Mondale supports the idea of establishing a series of regional primaries and caucuses so candidates can spend more time campaigning in every state.
By getting that candidate in their region and having his undivided attention for several days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, that they're going to get that candidate to better understand them, their region, and what's needed.
Both Illinois Senator Alan Dixon, a Democrat, and Oregon Senator Bob Packwood, a Republican, are sponsoring regional primary bills. Both would cut campaign costs and may shorten the so-called primary season. But Mondale fears interest in the idea may soon be forgotten.
Once the process is over, and it ends today, we all kind of forget about it. And then 4 years later, we go back into the same mess, and people said, oh, we forgot to fix it up.
The median length of notice provided by companies that close the facility or have a permanent layoff is 7 days for blue-collar workers and 14 days for white-collar workers. I ask you, is that humane? Is that fair?
This may be so concerning formal notice, but based on my experience in business, it really is a very rare occasion. Sometimes because of labor strife that happens, but other than that, it almost never happens.
I'm Colleen Needles at the White House. Today I attended a post-summit briefing with President Reagan. I'll have details at 6.
Well, it's very difficult to assess at this time. Our meeting with the Secretary, he has rejected our request to open up the Conservation Reserve.
Clarify again today what the Secretary...
At this time, no.
Go there, but they've specified theirs would be if I listened to him long enough, I would be convinced that we're in an economic downturn and that people are homeless and people are going without food.
In city areas and elsewhere. We're not really competing with them, but merely committed to affordable housing for the poor since 1960. Networks of people. Housing was invented in the last 20 years.
I'd like to extend this welcome and our newest member.
It's a real struggle because the federal assistance is really critical. It's just no one else can pay that cost, so we really have to get the federal government back in the picture.
We operate about 2,300 units, Skip, all for low-income people. We'll see an increase in homelessness, and we already are. We're seeing.
I think that what we're talking about here, of course, is the problems, and so.
Realistically, I think it's new priorities are necessary in order to achieve the type of dollars necessary to show some turnaround in terms of meeting housing needs.
So that's next year at the earliest, then?
Well, that's right.
We have technical experts here.
Short of rain dance and beating drums, I don't know what the hell else we can do. We've just about covered every single base.
Minneapolis base, mostly grain movers. When that happened, the world was all of a sudden awash with petroleum. Even if it's happening in Greenville, Mississippi, or Vicksburg, or Hannibal, Missouri, down in Mark Twain country, it affects what happened up in the land of the Swedes. I didn't. I guess I have that conventional idea that it is. I like Minneapolis. I was out there last year. It sure is a nice city.
The price of grains and vegetables continue to soar on the commodity markets as the scorching heat and drought continue to choke out farm crops. And that means many farmers in Minnesota and elsewhere are facing significantly lower federal subsidy or deficiency payments. While that could save Uncle Sam as much as $15 billion, some in Congress want to earmark all that money right now as disaster relief for crop farmers. But Agriculture Secretary Richard Ling wants to go slow.
Because we do have some time before we can actually measure the losses on most crops or even on livestock.
But it is livestock producers who most need help now, according to two Minnesota lawmakers.
The problems with the farmers who have cattle are far more serious at the present time than those with crops.
There are no grain farmers, no row crop farmers right now who need financial assistance.
The members of Congress all agree that massive aid for farmers and rural communities will be needed if the drought continues, and the outlook for Minnesota isn't good.
It does not at this time appear to suggest that we will see any significant changes in the pattern which has been established for the last week to 10 days.
While no member of the task force would hazard a public guess on the total price tag for disaster relief, several privately were saying it could total between $25 and $50 billion. Skip Loescher, CCO News, Washington. 3, 2, 1. While no member of the task force would hazard a public guess on the total price tag for disaster relief, several members were privately saying it could total between $25 and $50 billion. Skip Loescher, 712 News, Washington.
Time of the year, I hope you can consider doing at this time in order for us to have
that would have precisely the opposite effect.
this opportunity to try to encourage more participation.
They share the time and very nice.
Thank you very much. I think this is something we should
Concern those who are.
Let's not rush to judgment. Let's not put something in place today that 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, 2 months down the road is inadequate. We have time to look.
We do know that the high cost of feed is forcing livestock producers to cull their herds. While that may cause the price of beef and pork to rise next year, right now there's such an abundant supply of red meat that wholesale and retail prices are dropping.
Have your order, please. Hi, may I please have 1 McChicken and 2 Quarter Pounders with cheese?
And a stern warning has been issued to the nation's biggest fast food chain and other retailers not to use the drought as an excuse to raise prices now.
It's selfish, it's unreasonable, and I don't think anybody's going to allow it. And now eventually food prices will rise, but we ought to watch some of those individuals who are out to just to capture a windfall profit.
Congress says it will ensure that there's an adequate supply of food for American consumers. But there's no doubt that the drought will increase the cost of some foods. Low yields of grain will eventually be reflected by higher prices for bread and other baked goods. Your carbohydrate cravings for pasta will likely cost you more. And the cost of some cereals, especially the wheat and oat ones, may go up. Higher farm feed costs will eventually mean higher prices for dairy products, and those feed costs, coupled with increased demand, will drive up the chicken prices as well. The government says those increases will be moderate, 3 to 5% this year, and won't have much of an impact on the overall inflation rate.
Well, we're all in agreement. How's that?
I think pretty good. I think excellent.
Or that can be done in addition to this.
A month to 6 weeks where we can develop.
Minutes I have to run.
Governor, how did the Secretary
It was a good meeting. It really and truly was. I feel confident we'll make it through this year.
Been very helpful and released the acres, and he's taken. And they know, like we do, that the livestock farmers are the ones that need the help, and they want to help. So what we really wanted from the Secretary here was to waive that repayment.
And this was promised to you?
Well, it wasn't promised, but they were very favorable to the idea.
Are working with the Secretary. And there's a concern that a lot of the control of that grain are in the hands of speculators, in the hands of the big grain companies, and they're going to profit.
And there may not be enough to go around. The reality of allowing grain producers and livestock producers to get access to that for feedstocks is further going to diminish those CCC stores, and there may not be enough grain to back up the PIC certificates.
You know, there's a potential that there could be a problem there. But seem to be mum on it. You know, we do have an awful lot in reserve right now, and it would take a tremendous crop loss across the farm belt in order to draw those reserves down to a point where we'd find ourselves short.
One of the most difficult problems is from a radar blip, particularly from a head-on target, to identify the type of aircraft.
The radar signal from a commercial airliner is much different from that from a Tomcat jet, the F-14.
Let's assume he could tell. It still could be a kamikaze plane, and in a hostile situation, as that plane continues to close on you, you have to make that subjective judgment to protect your ship and your crew.
We're fighting in a lake, and when flights come feet wet out of Iran, very few seconds, no matter what.
Without objection, the requested majority leader's orders.
Mr. President, I thank the distinguished...
It will mean that the cash flow into rural America, rural Minnesota, will continue. If a guy loses all of his crops, then he'll get 52 cents on a dollar.
And we must.
Some if we've got enough money, but Alexander, I think it has some real shortcomings. Their feed costs will be 150 to 175% of what they were last year. And I think that's going to be an extremely hard hit for a lot of those people. He's just totally left swinging on this one.
The question before members of the House this afternoon was simple. Should federal court juries be allowed to impose the death penalty for anyone, even a first-time offender, convicted of a drug-related murder? Or in a civilized society, is the most effective deterrent to drug-related killings a mandatory life prison sentence? As expected, the arguments on both sides were emotional.
Deterrent is a swift and final punishment. And that's the way it should be for those who would kill mercilessly for profit or for the furtherance of an enterprise that is bent on poisoning the public and ruining the lives of our children.
The bums aren't afraid of the death penalty that are dealing in drugs. They live under the fear of death every day, but they're driven by motivations of greed. And so they don't give a darn whether there's a death penalty or not.
Gosh, if we're going to have a death penalty for anything, we ought to have it for somebody who traffics in narcotics, who does something that results in the death of another human being.
If you're looking for some way to punish, as the gentleman from New York so rightly called it, those bums, those thugs who deal in drugs, put them in jail and let them think about it for a lifetime. That is punishment.
Republicans Bill Frenzel and Arlen Stanglin were the only Minnesotans to vote for the death penalty. But they were part of a vast majority as the House voted by nearly a 3-to-1 margin to allow the so-called ultimate penalty for drug-related murders. Skip Loescher, CCO News, Washington. A first trimester abortion, no matter what the reason, is legal for any woman who can afford to pay for it. But for 8 years now, anti-abortion forces have kept a poor woman from getting a federally funded abortion, even if she is the victim of rape or incest and promptly reports it to authorities. The Senate tried to change that this summer by attaching an amendment to the billion-dollar-plus Health and Human Services funding bill. The House said no, and last Friday, after receiving a veto threat from the president, the House stuck to its guns.
Taking innocent, unborn life will not ease the abuse of rape.
It is against the standard of the taking of a human life that all other actions, even actions as horrible as cases of rape and incest, must be judged.
All we are talking about is whether there is an opportunity for the poor to be treated the same way as the rich.
The House again rejected the rape and incest provisions, setting the stage for today's confrontation in the Senate.
I am tired of the abortion argument dominating the debate on any issue here in the United States Senate.
Nevertheless, Weicker and other proponents argued that the Senate should also stick to its guns, and late this morning, by a 2-vote margin, it did. But opponents claimed a fight with the House and the President would jeopardize funding for many health and welfare programs. So the Senate reconsidered, and this afternoon, by a 4-vote margin, opted for the status quo. And so the situation will be just as it has been for the past 8 years. Medicaid funds can only be used to pay for an abortion if the life of the mother is at stake. Skip Loescher, CCO News, Washington. What better place to do cold weather research than Minnesota? And the FAA now plans to use state facilities in Monticello and International Falls to find better ways of de-icing and defrosting airplanes and to improve traction on airport runways and taxiways. Candidates for the FAA's Air Traffic Control Academy in Oklahoma will be pre-qualified by Minnesota's Community College and Votech Systems, which will be used for the first time in the nation to coordinate a statewide program to train prospective controllers. And the FAA will also use the University of Minnesota's Supercomputer Center to run complex aviation simulations. This first-ever partnership between the FAA and any state was announced this afternoon during a Capitol Hill reception hosted by Northwest Airlines.
I don't think there's any more money coming from the feds. This will be, we're still funding our community colleges and technical institutes by the state of Minnesota.
FAA Administrator Alan McCarter isn't sure how much of a monetary harvest Minnesota will reap, but he did say,
sure, some of that money then will come into the state for specific projects. Absolutely, absolutely.
Despite that, Representative Jim Oberstar, who chairs the House subcommittee which oversees the FAA, says he will not stop pressing for better safety.
There will be no tolerance on my part of FAA's shortcomings in the safety issues.
Skip Loescher, CCO News, Washington. John Kennedy thrashed Richard Nixon in the first televised presidential debates. A misstatement by Gerald Ford gave Jimmy Carter a boost in 1976. And Bush campaign aides fear the vice president may be his own worst enemy this Sunday.
It's just some lower-level hand-wringers who think I'm going to screw it up.
So both Bush and his aides have been downplaying expectations about his performance against Michael Dukakis.
He's probably a better debater. I'm lowering expectations.
They're doing what is very smart in the sense of trying to lower the expectations for George Bush. George Bush is a much better debater than people give him credit for.
The fact is, the vice president is prone to misstatement.
10 days before I was sworn in as President of the United States.
On the other hand, Dukakis aides worry that people might expect too much from their candidate, especially since he used to host a public TV show on which controversial issues were debated.
Tonight our debate is on legalizing marijuana.
On the stump, Bush has attacked Dukakis at every turn, but only recently has the Massachusetts governor begun to fight back.
And he was disastrously and completely and unforgivably wrong.
And with his campaign flagging, Sunday's debate offers Dukakis a major opportunity.
One could expect to see as much as 10% change in voter attitudes from the debates. Why? Because 40% or more of this electorate is what we would call soft, malleable, changeable.
Most observers believe Dukakis needs a clear-cut win in Sunday's debate, while Bush can afford to get along with a draw. The verdict will be rendered by the up to 100 million Americans who are expected to watch. Skip Loescher, CCO News, Washington. The federal minimum wage was raised to $3.35 an hour 7 years ago. Most Republicans and businesses say now is not the time for a big increase.
What will actually result is more unemployment precisely among the people who are expected to be helped by the increase in the minimum wage.
Nonsense, say most Democrats and organized labor. Everyone will benefit if the lowest paid make more money.
Why shouldn't those individuals who haven't had any increase in the cost of living for the last 7 years at least be put on a par in purchasing power where they were 7 years ago?
Senator Dave Dernberger would go along with some increase in the federal minimum wage, and Senator Rudy Boschwitz suggests giving poor minimum wage families a tax break.
If they work, they will get a refundable tax credit. It'll be added to their paycheck each payday.
Some increase in the federal minimum wage is almost certain in this election year, but not to the $4.65 or $5.05 an hour, which many Democrats favor. The best guess now is that Congress will wind up raising it to no more than $4.25 an hour, but that it will be passed by a large enough margin to override a possible presidential veto. Skip Loescher, CCO News, Washington. The first stop on Shevardnadze's agenda was the vice president's official residence, where he said George Bush has been involved in all high-level superpower talks. Today's meeting was requested by Bush. The next stop was the State Department, where the Soviet foreign minister had an announcement of sorts.
He has been now permitted to visit the Soviet Union, to visit his sick mother.
Shevardnadze was referring to the Armenian immigrant who jumped out in front of his motorcade yesterday carrying a sign reading, "Gorbachev, let me visit my dying mother." Shevardnadze got out and spoke with the man yesterday and today announced that the man would be granted a visa to return to the Soviet Union. Later, Shevardnadze and Secretary of State Shultz discussed trouble spots in the Mideast and Southern Africa, but neither man had any public comment on the Gorbachev proposal to implement interim limits on long-range nuclear weapons.
We don't think we'll get a final agreement before the end of the administration, but we'd sure like to make as much progress as possible.
The president and Shevardnadze echoed those words when they met reporters in the White House Rose Garden.
Do you think you'll see Mr. Gorbachev again before you leave office?
Perhaps in Oslo.
It's a good possibility.
U.S. officials doubt that will happen, but do think Shevardnadze and Shultz could meet late this year to sign some minor arms control agreements. Skip Loescher, CCO News, Washington. Did either candidate score a knockout punch?
No. Very active in the homeless. My campaign chairman, Secretary...
To be able to say a little something more about dealing with deficit. I think Governor Dukakis did what he needed to do to stay apace in this presidential race.
Did George Bush, Bill Frenzel, keep the image that he has portrayed very successfully since New Orleans as a decisive leader?
I think that he did a good job of defending that position and that image. For your experience, the expectation is that everybody says Quayle is something. Bush is ahead, then Dukakis has to get much tougher next time around. He's had one for drill. If it's even, then I think they play coy.
The next debate, I hope, will be more revealing about the substance of those issues, and they may have to take after each other a little more. I hope not.
As this session of Congress nears an end, the cry for new acid rain legislation gets louder.
We can't afford the delay. The price is too high to pay.
We haven't acted on acid rain. We haven't done our job.
The bill has been bottled up in the Senate by Majority Leader Robert Byrd, whose home state of West Virginia is a major producer of high-sulfur coal, which, when burned, emits sulfur dioxide, a major contributor to acid rain. But Byrd has now agreed to a compromise, reducing those emissions by 8.5 million tons over 15 years and allowing utilities to charge ratepayers for installing anti-pollution equipment.
The Byrd compromise is not the best way to do acid rain. The problem is we may wait here until all the forests die and all the fish die before we get the best, and so we may have to go with this.
And Durenberger warns that it may not be politically possible to get a better bill next year.
We're not going to fall for a bad non-attainment urban smog component and a bad acid rain component just to get something through.
But Sikorsky also warns that there's a danger in waiting.
If it isn't this, it's probably nothing until the new president comes in.
There is, of course, still the chance this compromise agreement will fall apart. But if it holds up, there's also a reasonable chance that acid rain legislation will pass the Senate and the House within the next couple of weeks. Skip Loescher, CCO News, Washington. AZT is not a cure for AIDS, but it does slow the spread of the virus. It prolongs the lives of some AIDS victims, and it is the only AIDS drug approved by the Food and Drug Administration. But it's an expensive drug. A year's supply costs about $8,000.
Without it, there are those that undoubtedly will die.
Last night, the Senate approved a $15 million measure to continue to provide AZT to those who can't otherwise afford it for the next 6 months. A score of Minnesotans are among the 6,000 or so AIDS victims nationally who rely on Uncle Sam to pay their AZT bills. But continued funding hit a snag this afternoon when proponents asked unanimous consent to bring it up for a vote in the House.
I am not willing to see legislation moved by unanimous consent until we are assured that we are going to get final action on a clean air bill.
And when no one could give Walker an absolute assurance that would happen, he objected, preventing the House from voting on the AZT bill. That was this afternoon. Tonight, proponents using a different procedure are expected to get a vote on the AZT matter, and the House is likely to approve it by an overwhelming margin. Skip Loescher, CCO News, Washington.
Hi, Jim Lumberstar.
Ian Martin. Good
Nice to meet you. You waiting?
No problem. You're a busy man.
Well, no, it wasn't that big. Was in the hospital. First time in her whole life she's in the hospital. She was about 9, and she was together. And it was true. And it was true.
I'm pretty sure that I will get a level playing field from the state and from Minnesota, and a fair hearing on this transaction.
That's your picture that was cut out in the...
Yeah. Yes. Yes, we got...
I think they're being very smart. I think, and secondly, that they were on the... I'm convinced they're making the expected promises, and they seem to be sincere about them, and I think the community has to make sure that they follow through.
What they're doing, and I guess what you say is, well, on the basis of what you say, I think this presents a new opportunity for economic growth for Pillsbury to penetrate the common market with American-made products.
I find it difficult to judge. I hear what they say, they sound good. I have not heard from Pillsbury people and what their concerns might be.
I'm pretty sure that I will get a level playing field from the state and from Minnesota, and a fair hearing on this transaction.
And she together. On the basis of the representations made, yes, it sounds good. I see potential for the future, penetration of the common market, penetration into the Pacific Rim in the future, and giving Minnesota business an opportunity to grow.
They ringed FDA headquarters, forcing police to turn away most of the agency's 5,000 employees when they arrived for work.
FDA, don't delay! 52 will die today!
52 people are dying of AIDS a day in this country, and they're holding on to drugs that are being released in other countries.
40,000 dead from AIDS! Where was the FDA?
We're here because our friends are dying, and there's 134 or so treatments that the FDA is not releasing to them.
Behind the barricades. Behind the barricades, please.
Most of the demonstrators did stay behind police barricades, but to illustrate their frustration, dozens laid down in the street in front of the main entrance and were arrested by police wearing rubber gloves.
How many more have to die? How many more have to die?
They planned to get arrested, and there was no violence.
I think that the ripple effect from these kinds of actions will lead us in a helpful direction.
The St. Paul pastor hopes the FDA will be more compassionate towards the terminally ill, whether they're dying from AIDS or cancer.
When it is safe, they could at that point, I think, make provisional release to patients who are seriously ill.
Chicago's O'Hare is the busiest airport in the world, but not as busy as it has been. A rash of mistakes by air traffic controllers has forced the FAA to cut back the number of rush-hour flights at O'Hare, and more cutbacks may be forthcoming. Despite a 40% increase in air traffic, O'Hare still only has about 2/3 of the journeyman controllers that it had before the 1971 strike. And the shortage of highly qualified controllers and safety inspectors is a nationwide problem. A recent General Accounting Office probe blames the FAA for its lax recruitment program.
There is no one in the Los Angeles, Oakland, San Francisco area who is responsible for recruitment for FAA.
Minnesota's Jim Oberstar, who heads the House subcommittee which oversees the FAA, says most of those who are recruited to attend the agency's training academy in Oklahoma never actually make it into the FAA's workforce.
The fact that you start with some 200 potential applicants and wind up with 0.8 of a controller, this dropout rate is absolutely astonishing.
Congressional critics are encouraged that the FAA admits it does have a problem and has promised to increase its efforts to solve it. But until that actually happens, many important safety-related positions will simply go unfilled. Skip Loescher, CCO News, Washington. Greg Coleman has worn a Vikings uniform for 10 of his 12 years in the NFL, a career in which he has averaged more than 40 yards a punt. He gets the ball off quickly, as evidenced by the fact that only 3 of his 781 kicks have been blocked. Coleman has been waiting for a chance to punt again since the Vikings cut him late this summer. Between his insurance business and broadcasting, Coleman's kept busy the past 2.5 months, but he just wasn't ready to walk away from pro football.
Somewhere in the back of my mind, I really felt deep down inside that I'd get a shot to play. Where and when, I didn't know. So it was a trying time for me to continue to keep working out, keep focused, and that's what I did. I think it was persistence over resistance.
Redskins Park was closed to reporters and photographers during today's practice. Head coach Joe Gibbs does that every Friday. And Coleman is looking forward to playing for Gibbs.
From all indications and knowing some of the guys on the Redskins, he's a very personable coach, and he's a great coach to play for. It's a very relaxed atmosphere here, and all he wants the guys to do is win.
But the Skins have already lost twice to the Giants and once to the Cardinals, the team they'll battle again Sunday at RFK. The Redskins hope Coleman will be the answer to a punting game which has been a problem for them all season long. If Greg can just boot them consistently for 40 yards or more and stay healthy, he'll have a job the rest of this season, and possibly a shot at winning a job next year, too. Skip Loescher, CCO News, Washington. A final House vote on the drug bill is expected in 2 to 3 hours, with the Senate slated to take up the bill once the House has acted tonight. The measure still contains the death penalty, but only for drug kingpins and major narcotics dealers involved in drug-related murders.
It's time to realize that we are at war, and being a nice guy doesn't necessarily win the war. It's time to stop turning the other cheek and start, ladies and gentlemen, taking an eye for an eye.
The bill will still allow first-time marijuana users to be fined up to $10,000, and drug users could still be stripped of such benefits as FHA home mortgage guarantees and student loans. It calls for creation of a cabinet-level czar to direct the nation's war on drugs, but it will not allow illegally seized evidence to be used in court, and it does not allow mandatory drug testing for people employed in the airline, rail, or bus industries. The measure does authorize spending $2 billion, evenly split between law enforcement efforts and drug treatment and education programs. But the bill only appropriates a quarter of that amount.
I think it's a vacant promise to the extent that we've only put a fourth of the money that's authorized and expected into it, and the others will be catch as catch can as we go through next year. And I think it underscores how this drug issue has been used politically.
Well, my thanks to...
How will the Democratic agenda differ from the Bush agenda?
Well, we won't know that until we see the Bush agenda. Well, we look forward to developing that in the near future. We await the desire of the president-elect and his team.
Four of us had very tough elections. Senator Thurmond took care of four of us, and Senator Chafee won. And Don Nichols is, where's Don? Don Nichols right here. One.
There are very few opportunities, and this was an opportunity, and that we had to do it quickly. He will indeed submit his own plan, his own budget to the Congress. I think we should get it done by February, and I think we can. We spent some very pleasant hours for a couple of days raising ability that's quite national and so forth. The hours have been just torturous, and the irregularity of the sessions have been difficult to cope with. It's got to be better. Probably it won't be much better, though.
The new role is that I'm going to take all the heat and the criticism of the campaign. Yes, that is my new assignment, and I'm willing to take it on very energetically.
He's got to demonstrate his capacity to grow, to have stature, and to be helpful on the things that really count. He deserves a chance, but he's got to show that he can grow. If we could reduce those dramatically and pull the forces back, say 300-400 miles from each other, we could change the world, because that's where the real costs are, and that's where the real danger of war is to be found. Gorbachev is on the way of becoming one of the most astonishing, surprising public leaders of our time. We've got to be sure that we keep our guard up. But boy, this guy is worth taking seriously. I mean, there's real risk here, but tremendous excitement, I think, connected with this leader.